So welcome everybody. My name is Bronwyn Ducktick, if you haven't met me yet, and I'm the Program Manager for Developing Talent at the Skoll Center. I also lead the Impact Lab program. So to start off our session today, many of you have been on Zoom sessions this morning, and many of you will be on Zoom sessions again this afternoon. And so we're going to do a little stretch, and it's called In My Household, We Stretch Like This. And so everybody has a particular stretch that they generally do when they're sitting on their computer when they're feeling a little bit tired. And so I'm going to start a stretch, and then I'm going to hand it over to somebody that I don't know to be able to stretch as well. So if you want to all put on your cameras so we can stretch together. So in my household, we stretch like this. So I take my hand behind, stretch, if you can do that with me. I love that stretch because I always like lean over my computer, and the other arm, perfect. And I'm gonna hand it over to Dawn if you wanna unmute yourself and do a stretch for us.
In my house, we stretch like this. Fingers crossed, out in front.
Oh, perfect.
And I'm gonna pass it on to Fernando.
In my house, we stretch like this. Arm over. And swap. And I'll pass it on to Henry.
Hi everyone. In my house, we stretch like this. And I'm at a disadvantage because I'm presenting. I can't see anyone else's names, so I'll need to get Bronwyn to pick for me, please.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. So hopefully we've all got some stretched in and some blood flowing in our bodies and in our brains as well. So again, today is one of our Impact Lab open series. The reason why we've decided to do these this year is to give the broader MBA class, the broader Oxfordshire community, and now that we're virtual, the world, whoever wants to join, an opportunity to engage with some of the topics that we discuss on Impact Lab, almost like a taster session, but also to think a little bit about the Skoll Center core concepts and some of our visiting fellows and our speakers that we engage with in the Impact Lab. So today's session is really looking at our core concept, which is social impact. And when you think about social impact, we need to really define what we mean by social impact and what we mean by these social and environmental problems. And one of the frameworks that we have to do that are the Sustainable Development Goals, which provide us a common language to really be able to frame large-scale, complex social and environmental problems. And so in Impact Lab, our module 1 is our module on the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is the one that Henry Majed leads. So we look at a critical perspective on the SDGs, looking more at the opportunities and the limitations of these. And I know some of you already have been involved in sustainability reporting for the corporates that you've been working with, some of the foundations. Some of you have been a part of actually even developing the indicator framework, and it's great to have you on the call here as well. We would like to look at sort of like how the Sustainable Development Goals are being measured using the indicator framework, and then also how they apply to big business. The reason we want to look at how they apply to big business is because we're doing MBAs in a business school, but also when you have a look at the reporting, the sustainability reporting, the integrated reporting that you'll see throughout the year, you'll have an opportunity to think critically about is true impact actually happening here, measurable impact, or is this clever marketing or PR campaigns? Are some corporates reporting that they're working on climate justice, but actually increasing inequalities in their supply chain as well? So we really want to be able to look at the difference between actual measurable change and greenwashing. So to help us do this today, I would like to introduce Henry Majed. Henry Majed is an Oxford MBA alumni. He is also a neurologist. He got his PhD at Cambridge. So he went to Oxford and that other university as well. He is a visiting fellow at the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. He's had senior roles within Mars, Johnson & Johnson, and 20th Century Fox. He recently led the Innovation Gateway, which was an award-winning alliance of leading corporations in sustainability. And he's working on a new venture called My Mind, which is a digital health platform. So we're really grateful to have you here with us today, Henry. Thank you so much. I've attached his LinkedIn in the chat box so you can connect with him. And over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you for the kind introduction and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for letting me join you this afternoon on our first Impact Lab taster, focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals and big business. As Bronwyn said, I'm an alumni and it's a real honour to return to SBS on the Skoll Speaker Series and as a visiting fellow of Skoll to share something that's been a really special and important and personal journey for me. And let me also recognise, let me take a moment to recognise some of the people in the room. I appreciate that we have a great number of experts, people with far greater expertise than I in some of these areas around Sustainable Development Goals. And I know we have people joining us from Singapore, Australia, around the world, and people who've reached out to me over the weeks, sharing some of their work. And I will try to touch on those during the conversation. And I'm very keen that we tap into that knowledge and experience within the room during the course of our session. So there will be opportunities to share some of that with each other. And as Bronwyn mentioned, I've had a colourful journey. So I started off trying to deal with problems from internally as a neurologist within the NHS, and then decided I wanted to have a bigger impact than I could by poking people with injections, and saw business as a platform for change. So moved into some large corporates like Mars, 20th Century Fox, Johnson & Johnson, eventually supporting the WHO on their global patient safety programs. And then I moved into big corporates focusing on sustainability, which is more like dealing with the external. And then, as Bronwyn mentioned, I stepped down from running the Innovation Gateway at the beginning of COVID to support our response to COVID-19 and mental health and well-being, and building something called My Mind. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to share that with you over future sessions. So that's a little bit about me. Let's get to know the room a little bit and let's understand where you stand. So I'm going to ask you in a moment to take a poll, and the poll, we call it fill in the blank, and the poll is based around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Is it UN SDGs and big business, or all big business? Do the Sustainable Development Goals enable big business? Does it empower big business? Or in your mind, does it distract big business and block big business from doing what they do? How do they fit together? Where are the synergies? And perhaps during the course of this session, you'll change your view on what that is, or at least have some different perspectives on that. So if Lydia, if you don't mind just putting the poll up for me, and I invite all of the audience to take that poll and share where you stand on this point. Let's have another 30 seconds just in case the last 8 people want to have a go. Fantastic. Okay, well, this is it's not exactly split. That's a 98% saying that the Sustainable Development Goals are an enabler for big business and vice versa, and only 2% that are saying or. So I will take that as permission to be the provocateur in this situation and offer some counter perspectives. Thank you, Lydia. Are you able to remove that poll now? Excellent. So if anyone else needs to reduce the poll, you just hit on the minimize button. So that gives us a sense for who's in the room. So let me tell you what's to come. So we're going to consider some of the greatest challenges that we're facing in society, and the fact that we're having this conversation. I've delivered this talk in different forms for the last 3 or 4 years, and this is the very first time I've had to do it over Zoom with 100 people listening in. So this is a sense of the kinds of challenges that we're facing, and we're going to consider how the Sustainable Development Goals can provide an approach to adapt and grow under these really volatile conditions. Some of you may be familiar with the VUCA world, and you certainly will be during the course of the MBA, a volatile, uncertain, chaotic, ambiguous world. We'll consider the context and opportunity for business. And we'll share some examples, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what it will take to be able to deliver against these. And then I'd like to give you the opportunity to consider the strategy, the SDG strategy for businesses that you're all familiar with. And either you can consider a business that has already expressed their Sustainable Development Goal ambitions, or you can consider one that's new for you and think about what the different perspectives, the pros, the cons, the risks could be. And then something I wanted to reference right at the front is that we will be rejoining at 7 p.m. this evening to engage in a Twitter chat. And we've reached out to around 100 senior sustainability executives who are sustainability champions in some of the biggest companies in the world, who I hope will be able to contribute and dip in and answer some of your questions and share their perspectives. And so you won't just be hearing from me, it will be a chance to really have a provocative and rich, nourishing discussion. So let's kick off. As we say, the 21st century challenges are a changing landscape which demand new approaches to adapt and grow. There's increasing pressure on resources, and we're not really in control of the risks and impacts anymore. There's a worldwide urban population that's growing from 3.6 billion in 2010 to 5 billion by 2030. There's greater competition for raw materials and natural resources, which means that by 2030, we'll need 50% more energy, 40% more water, 60% more agricultural production to serve the entire population. And some of you will be familiar with the work of one of our colleagues, Kate Rayworth, who wrote The Donut Economy and launched Amsterdam as one of the first donut economy cities very recently. Some of these challenges, which we sometimes describe as wicked challenges, are unstructured, they're interconnected, and there are multiple stakeholders that are impacted at different stages. They're not the kind of problems that can be solved simply. There's no template that we can follow, and we're not able to come in and say, I'm a finance professional, I'll solve it with my finance tools, or I'm an entrepreneur, I'll solve it with my entrepreneur tools. It takes a systemic approach. And often solutions are not simply true or false or good or bad. There's a spectrum, and we need to consider these different angles. And so often these are hard or impossible to measure and be able to claim success. Which is why the Sustainable Development Goals were developed. And I think our poll showed a 98% in favour of Sustainable Development Goals as being a positive force for good across business and vice versa. And this is some of the data from a report a couple of years ago. And I think what we've seen is a similar shift and change in appreciation for this over the recent years with more of these challenges that we're facing. So what is sustainability? Sustainable development is seen as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet our own needs. So it needs to be social, it needs to be economic, it needs to touch on environmental. It needs to be equitable, bearable, and viable. So, where did these start? They started with some letters. The letters were the MDGs. So in the year 2000, a number of governments wrote a letter with the UN to address the most challenging issues they were facing. They were looking to drive progress for fewer people living in poverty, greater gender balance in education, more access to clean water and medication. And it galvanized an unprecedented effort to address global development challenges focused on the poorest and most marginalized people. Then, in 2015, the UN came up with an audacious plan to transform the world into one where everyone and everywhere can have a decent life, where prosperity is shared and the planet's protected, simultaneously tackling economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. And they set these 17 goals for the world's future through to 2030. And some of you will have already met with and heard from Paul Polman, who was formerly the CEO of Unilever, and now we're very privileged to have as the chair of our board at SBS, and who was very involved in this. And these 17 goals are backed by 169 detailed targets and 300 indicators to demonstrate our progress and give us a framework to be able to work towards these. And these were negotiated over 2 years from 2015 and agreed by nearly all nations around the world. So another way we might think about these is covering 5 spheres really important for human species and planet, the 5 Ps. So people, prosperity, which is the economic, and planet, which is the environmental, as well as considering peace and partnerships, because we're not able to do this on our own. What's new and different about the Sustainable Development Goals from the MDGs? Well, these include every nation and every sector, We describe them as universal. They recognize that every goal is interconnected in a system. We can't solve these in isolation, and we describe this as integration. And finally, they recognize that achieving the goals require big changes to how we live, which we call transformation, which has never been more present than why we're here right now over Zoom and facing the kinds of challenges like COVID-19, climate impacts, AI and data security, so many things that have required us to change the way that we live and work. So let me share some of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll race through these, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that these indicators represent. So the first one, ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. So one of the indicators by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, measured as people living on less than $1.25 per day. Reduce at least half the proportion of men, women and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions, according to national definitions. Number 2, ending hunger. Number 3, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all. Inclusivity and quality education. Gender equality and empowering women and girls. Access to water, sanitation. Access to energy. Anyone who was involved in the GO2 programme last year knows that energy and climate impact featured heavily. Promoting inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. Building a resilient infrastructure. Reducing inequality within and among countries. Making cities inclusive and safe, enabling people to thrive and flourish. Ensuring sustainable consumption and production. Sorry, I lost my screen then. Taking urgent action on climate change and impacts. Conserving and sustainable use of the oceans. Managing the forests and the land. Driving peace. And of course, engaging in partnerships global across cities, civil society and business. So I call this the SDG OMG slide. This describes the 169 commandments, as sometimes people call them. Some of the critiques of the Sustainable Development Goals is that there are too many. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. How do you prioritize? We'll get a chance to consider this towards the end of the session. Many of them are vague aspirations rather than clever goals or targets. They're extremely difficult to measure, and I've picked out some of the examples of the measures and systems that we use, but many of them don't interrelate or speak to each other. And your choice is dependent on the type of business you are and the ambitions. Not everyone's in the same level playing field of having a common glossary or language that they're able to use to identify what their ambitions are, who the stakeholders are who are impacted, and how they choose to move forward. And literally, nobody believes that the SDGs can be nailed. So this is why we're here. So where does business fit in? There's a growing recognition and evidence that CEOs, investors, customers, employees, students demand a positive impact that can lead to a positive financial performance for business and society. There are new models of growth, many of them you'll be familiar with from your time within Oxford. We're very privileged to have much of the thought leadership having developed from here or being involved around greater resilience, the license to operate, securing supply, protecting revenue, the cost of capital. And it's estimated that the SDGs can create 12 trillion plus US dollar market opportunity. Many believe it can be many times more than that. Gender equality alone could add 25 trillion to the economy. However, there's a 2.5 trillion financing gap to be able to support this. And so there's much debate as to whether this is a 12 trillion opportunity or a 2.5 trillion hole. Of course, this spotlights an opportunity for strategic competitive advantage within business and society. And as business students and the SBS community, you know that wherever there's a strategic competitive advantage, businesses get interested. There's been a shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder primacy, a recognition that simply thinking about shareholders isn't sufficient, and we need to think about all of the different people that are impacted. And some of the research that has developed out of Oxford includes the enacting purpose within modern corporation that was released by colleagues Rupert Younger, Bob Eccles, Colin Mayer and others earlier this year. And recent reports within McKinsey and HBR around how business as usual will not save the planet, the role of corporation in society, and HBR's Making Sustainability Count collection. Some of the definitions for sustainability in business and the role of corporation. This is a recent one from Colin. The role of the corporation is to produce profitable solutions to problems of people and planet, not to profit from producing problems for people and planet. And one of my favourites from Paul Polman, who I think describes it most succinctly: there is no business case in enduring poverty or runaway climate change. So let's have a look at what this means. Again, wherever there's an opportunity for strategic competitive advantage, businesses like to get involved. So many of you will be familiar with Larry Fink. He's the chief exec of the biggest asset manager in the world, BlackRock. And he's written a letter, another letter each year from 2015. And the most recent one perhaps was the most precise and directive. And things he drew out earlier this year in Davos. A company cannot achieve long-term profits without embracing purpose. Ultimately, purpose is the engine of long-term profitability. We will be increasingly disposed to vote against management and board directors when companies are not making sufficient progress on sustainability. So it was something of a surprise when on Sunday this week in the FT, this report came out. BlackRock criticised over dropping climate votes. And of course, this wasn't really a surprise. We've heard this all before. We've heard it over the years. And actually, if I'm honest, this is probably the year where it's had the greatest traction. BlackRock, Larry Fink, all of the investors, post Davos, even I was being reached out to by many of these organizations saying, we need to get ahead of climate impacts. We know we need to engage with the Sustainable Development Goals. We just don't know how, we don't know where to start, we don't know what to do. And so there was this engagement, but it's going to take more engagement, more understanding, more consumer, investor and market pressure to really drive this forward. But it's a step in the right direction, and I hope I'll be able to share some of the examples over the next few slides. So what are some of the value drivers for business? Top line growth. There's an opportunity to grow your business through attracting and retaining customers. There's an opportunity to boost your brand and your corporate reputation. There's an opportunity to think differently and innovate around your products and drive greater quality. Cost and risk reduction, fundamental to business. Operational resilience, improving your security of supply, improving your resource efficiency, which also, of course, reduce costs. Productivity uplift, employee engagement and talent retention. Some of the work through the career service at the business school and also at the university. Earlier this year, asked students and employers what they were looking for in their future employees. And there was a real shift towards people wanting to work in responsible businesses that are showing due regard to the planet and people and society. Regulatory and legal. By getting ahead of the climate impacts and sustainable development goals, it gives you greater freedom and allows you to drive greater deregulation to allow you to shift your business. It gives you access to subsidies and incentives and a license to operate. And of course, it optimizes your assets. As business students, you'll be learning about enhanced returns and capital allocation, reducing your investment risk and improving your access to capital. So many drivers for businesses to change, but of course, that drives different perspectives and different actions. And we'll look at how a number of different businesses have taken these actions over recent years. So let's put it into practice. The first one we'll pick up, Unilever. We touched on this a little earlier. This was the business that Paul Polman has been leading, and many of you who've been following the markets have seen how Unilever have been tracking ahead of the FTSE 100 by driving this sustainability agenda. My message with Unilever, many of you will be familiar with the work that they do, is that you need to be bold. If you're going to get ahead of the SDGs and be a successful business, you need to be. And Paul Polman showed this by opting out of quarterly reporting when he announced the Unilever Sustainable Development Goals around 10 years ago. And of course, the market reacted. The market fell off their chairs, the market divested. Saying that this was crazy, this was lunacy. But Paul Polman stuck to his guns and said, if we're looking to future-proof our business and looking to think about the long-term strategic benefit for people, society, and the business, it's simply not compatible with quarterly reporting, and that's how he stepped out. And you see how they've been able to transform their business and make sustainable development goals a strategic priority, not just in the marketing that they do, not just in the cost cutting, not just in the compliance, but also in the strategic way they drive the business, and the fact that it's embedded within the business and the people that are running this aren't the sustainability managers, it's the operations managers, it's the supply chain managers, it's the business leaders, it's the financial directors. It's all of the people from within the business changing the way they fundamentally operate, which allows them to have these bold, ambitious goals around improving health and well-being for over 1 billion people, reducing environmental impact by half whilst doubling the size of their business and enhancing the livelihoods for millions. And I invite you to take a look at this Unilever sustainability report. This is the 2019 report, the most recent one, where you can see across each of these different areas, health and hygiene, nutrition, greenhouse gases, Unilever haven't just stood on their pedestal, but they've also been very open and humble to say, this is what we're trying to do and this is where we have got to. And it's very clear that we don't yet have the full measures to fully track and measure and drive this progress. But by going into this with humility and being transparent, we're able to understand where we are and what we need to do differently. So this is Unilever, and I encourage you, there's a link at the end of the presentation to be able to find the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And also, I hope many of you will have the opportunity to discuss this with Paul in the coming months, potentially even later today. Another one that you will all be familiar with is Patagonia, a very well-known outdoor clothing provider. But again, what many people don't know is that, again, they've been very bold and willing to, another one of the features that make a successful business engaging with sustainable development goals authentically is a willingness to be wrong. And Patagonia started off as a mountaineering company, and they courted a lot of bad publicity around 20 years ago because they were seeing their pitons they were using for climbing were damaging the rock. And they listened to the pressure, they listened to the consumers, they listened to their customers and said, actually, we're not willing to accept this anymore. They're willing to accept where they've made mistakes, and they did something about it. And so they shifted their business and said, yes, now we want to contribute towards society. We don't want to be damaging rock. They were the first major Californian company to become a B Corporation. They joined the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and really drive circular economy principles. And some of the examples of the thing that they do that are really embedded within the business is putting 1% of their profits towards an earth tax, contributing towards environmental businesses. They've adapted their methods. They donate their Black Friday sales figures to sustainable initiatives. And again, another example of how they've been able to be authentic and listen to their customers is how in some of the woolen products that they were using, there was feedback that they weren't as ethical or weren't as sustainable as they thought they were. They listened to this feedback, they listened to the consumers, and they changed the way that they operated, recognizing that it might well reduce the margins initially, but the longer term opportunities and benefits were much greater. Another example is around how they enable activism, some of the boycotts that they've taken part in. Some of the slides I haven't even dared to, some of the images I haven't even dared to put onto this slide, but I encourage you to look at some of the labels that they're using currently to make their voice heard and to raise their head above the parapet and to be bold. So this is some of the examples of the good. So actually, here's another one. So Lemonade is so Patagonia and Unilever are large mega companies, and you don't need to be a mega company to drive innovation and to align with the Sustainable Development Goals. So Lemonade is a more recent company. They've recently had taken a lot of investment from Google Ventures, and they're an impact-driven insurance company. And many will, sometimes people think that finance sector, insurance, reinsurance are less able to adapt to Sustainable Development Goals. And Lemonade is an example of an insurer who they take 25% of their insurance revenues as a fee to fund their management, and then 75% is put aside to cover the insurance costs and reinsurance. And anything that isn't then distributed to cover insurance costs is distributed towards sustainability initiatives. And so demonstrating how you're able to have a very successful and impactful business whilst having due regard to the societal benefits. So let's take another one. This one, perhaps not so good, but one that we're all familiar with. Fast fashion. Fashion is something that's front of mind at the moment. There have been some recent events in the news, and many people have been using these kinds of products. When you're dealing with quality, when you're dealing with fast fashion, quality is sometimes compromised, prices can be compromised. And H&M tried to get ahead of this by creating the Conscious range with the byline, "Let's be conscious." It was a fantastic marketing campaign. It generated much attention, and many people felt like they wanted to go and shop in H&M. However, we need to consider the entire value chain. We need to consider all of the stakeholders who are impacted, not just the textiles that we're using, not just any one individual stakeholder. What they didn't take into account is that 80% of textiles, particularly within fast fashion, which is designed to be thrown away after 6 months or a year, 80% of these textiles are discarded or incinerated or go to landfill, meaning these really aren't as conscious as we might have first thought. Price, H&M competed on trying to drive the lowest cost and to encourage customers. However, this does mean that you're putting increasing pressure on your supply chain. And sometimes without the supply chain transparency, you don't know what's happening inside your factories, whether that's in Leicester, as the Boohoo case recently, or Rana Plaza in Bangladesh back in 2012, 2013, which was a tragic accident. But the brands that were using them simply weren't close enough to the supply chain and what was happening, the transparency within the supply chain to understand what's happening within the suppliers. And this simply isn't good enough. Conscious also are using organic cotton and recycled polyester, which they describe as being a great sustainable innovation. But they're not taking into account that for every t-shirt that they produce, it's using an average of 20,000 litres of water. So within the Sustainable Development Goals, we really need to ensure that we're taking into account all of the different stakeholders, all of the different resources and how they're impacted. And really the truth is that we're a part of these stakeholders. We're also responsible for supporting these brands. And we need to make sure that our voices are heard in the way that we shop, in the way that we work, in the way that we be. So we've covered the good and we've covered the bad. Now let's talk about Volkswagen. So some of you may be familiar with a campaign that unraveled in rather a dramatic way for VW in 2015. There's a big focus around moving away from diesel particulates and PM10s and air pollution. And so VW were very vocal in how they have really cleaned up their act, how clean diesel technology impacts fuel efficiency and performance, and being an eco-conscious choice. However, a whistleblower within the organization revealed that they were actually installing software to pass nitrous oxide tests, which meant that they were able to pass the test, but these were immediately deactivated after the vehicle was tested, meaning that they were 40 times over the safe level. This is something that unraveled for VW and cost them tens of billions of pounds in fines. And whilst it can take many, many years to build a reputation, it can sometimes take seconds or minutes to lose that reputation. And there are many examples of these organizations that perhaps don't think about the broader reach, the wider stakeholder ecosystem in the decisions that they're making and the way that they're engaging with these sustainable development goals. And Volkswagen is one of these examples. So, this is the report in The Economist, The Dirty Secrets. So let's put this into practice and give you an opportunity to think about some businesses that you are familiar with or that you're interested in exploring yourselves. So in a moment, we're going to invite you to break out into groups of 5. And what we're going to ask you to do is to put yourselves in the shoes of an interesting business, a business that either interests you, a business that you're uncertain about, a business that you'd like to know more about. And we'd like you to have a discussion within the group around these things. Who are the stakeholders across the value chain within this business? Who are the people who experience these SDG outcomes? This is the people inside the organization. This is the customers. This is the consumers. It might also be more and more. When we ran the session last year, someone picked out the fact, it was around the David Attenborough movement. Someone picked out the fact that the fish and the animals in the sea with some of the stakeholders around plastic if you're a drinks manufacturer. So who are the different people who are impacted and how do they fit together? Then I'd like you to think about what are the SDGs that are impacted by your business and the value chain. So think about the direct and the indirect. If you take a company like Unilever, they're probably in control of around 15% of their direct sustainable development goal impacts. The majority of those impacts we call second tier, which is their suppliers and the supply chain or their customers. So think about which SDGs are impacted and think about how you will prioritize those. Then I'd like you to think about how you create distributed or shared value. How do you create value across the stakeholders? What are ways that people might engage or be interested or excited? What are the motivations to make people change their behavior? If we did this talk, when we did this talk 2 or 3 years ago in one of the lecture theatres, we saw every desk had people with plastic bottles of water. I'm sure there aren't many people on this call right now who have plastic bottles of water. How do we drive that behavior change? And what are the risks and mitigations? And then finally, what we'd like you to think about is, what's a public commitment that you can make to hold yourself accountable? What's your equivalent of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan? What's the pithy commitment that will mean that you're really driving change systematically and integrating sustainable development goals within to solve meaningful problems profitably? And we're going to invite you to take 10 minutes now in your breakout groups to consider these questions. Bronwyn, is there anything that you'd like to add before Lydia splits everyone up into these groups? And we'll keep these up for just a moment so you're able to take a note of each of the things for you to talk about. And what we'd like you to do is to share your reflections in the chat. So it doesn't need to be a commentary on all of these, but just anything that catches you by surprise or any key points that come out in your discussion, we'd invite you to share within the chat so we're able to look at those together as a group when we come back.
No, that sounds great. Thank you, Henry. I think with the time we can go into our groups. Some people are already sharing some links to some additional information and documents. Please keep that coming. We're building a community of practice here. We know that many of you students don't come as empty vessels.
It's really important, as you've touched on, to consider the full spectrum of the value chain. Think about all of the different people that are impacted and think about the different ways that they're impacted. Within the group that that I was with, we considered how you really drive behavior change. How do you motivate and create these incentives to get people to do something that they might not initially be comfortable with, but that will distribute this shared value across the group. And within the Impact Lab, when we do the SDGs and Big Business module in December, we'll try to get into these questions in a more critical way and think about the comparison between different types of organizations, perhaps the comparison between Unilever and Amazon, or between a small business and a large business, or between a fund and a charity, for example, so that we're able to get a really critical perspective. So, in summary, hopefully you've seen that the Sustainable Development Goals in business are synergistic and can be symbiotic. A healthy economy is possible with a healthy planet, promoting genuinely sustainable and equitable growth. I really like Paul Polman's comment that there's no business case in enduring poverty or climate change. And the Sustainable Development Goals can give us a roadmap to deliver this transition. But there's no time to lose. We've shown the examples. You need to be ambitious, you need to be brave, you need to be humble, and you need to be authentic. And as students and a community of friends of Oxford, of SBS, of the Skoll Centre, and of the wider community, we all have a clear role to play as future leaders. And whichever path we take, whichever career we choose, we have a chance to shape the agenda and help to deliver a better world for all, solving meaningful problems profitably. Thank you very much for joining the session. I hope I've been able to give you some different perspectives into SDGs and business. And I hope you'll be able to join me later today, where we engage with other sustainability leaders, sharing their perspectives and their challenges, and we're able to answer some more of your questions. Thank you very much, and back to Bronwyn.
Thank you so much, Henry. And as always on Zoom, it's quite difficult to show appreciation for our speakers. So please, if you could clap your hands, use your reaction buttons. Thank you, Henry, for being with us today and preparing that session for us. As Henry said, please do continue with these conversations throughout the year, whether you're part of Impact Lab or not. We would love to engage with you. There's an answer about, there's a question, sorry, around about recording. Yes. The session is recorded and will be available on the Skoll Center Canvas page, as all of our Impact Lab open sessions will be as well. So we do have a Twitter chat happening this evening at 7 o'clock. And Henry has really kindly reached out to a number of sustainability leaders that will be joining us. You just need to go to the Skoll Center page on Twitter at 7 o'clock and we'll be engaging there. And I think the Twitter chats is just an idea for us to really start networking in a different way off Zoom and giving us different platforms to meet people, alumni, and some of our broader partnerships as well. So please do sign up for that. Well, you don't need to sign up, you just need to show up, actually, to be honest. Our next session is going to be demystifying systems change. Systems change, again, is a core concept from the Skoll Center. You will be doing a little bit around systems change, mostly in your go-to, which is part of your core curriculum for the MBA, but also map the system as well if you're interested in partaking in that. Next week, we're going to be looking at some of the concepts of systems change, and then we have two of our postdoc researchers who will be joining us, sharing some of their research around supply chains, which is really exciting. Some of the things that we discussed today. In my group, we discussed COVID-19 face masks. We made up a fictional company thinking about the supply chain around developing face masks, and that these things will be with us a little bit more longer term. So we'll be looking around the systems around supply chains, the response to COVID-19, and we'll also be looking at some new approaches to systems change, which is systems hacking, how to respond to a system, not always to understand the full system, but to find these hacks. And we're going to be sharing some more of our research around that. And I think a lot of students found that engaging in systems change thinking before Map the System and Go-To gave them a head start. And we did this in Impact Lab last year. So now you have an opportunity to engage in systems thinking before you go into these activities. We had an Impact Lab student who was on the winning team for both Go-To and Map the System last year. So that's it from me. I don't want to go over too much. I'm just going to check the chat if there's any other questions that anybody's put in. Nope, there you see the link for our next session. Yeah, so be safe. Remember to wear a mask, remain social distancing, be kind to yourself and others. And thank you again, Henry. And we look forward to seeing you all this evening on Twitter, hopefully.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.